Okay, so I think we're ready for our first session. So I would like to introduce Siobhan Haimé from the University of Leeds Libraries, who's going to be talking to us about ebook accessibility. Over to you, Siobhan.
Right. Thank you. So as Darren said, I will be talking about ebook accessibility, and I am Siobhan. I work at the University of Leeds Libraries as a acquisitions and reading list assistant. So in my day job, I work on reading lists, but I'll be talking about a project I did on accessibility. And it would be marvelous if my slides would work. There we go. So to give a bit of background about this project, I did this as part of a 0.2 FTE secondment. So I currently have a day a week for this academic year to research this. So this means I don't have a background in accessibility or digital accessibility. It is very much something I fell into when I questioned digital accessibility, and I wondered if we had any support for that, which we didn't. So I've been working on investigating both barriers to ebook accessibility, because we'd like to create better support and a support resource for our students, and also if there are any library processes that we can investigate around acquisition and around generally how we work with ebooks and how we can improve things for our users. And a very key part of this project has been working with our students. In fact, this was a condition of the secondment, is to have active student involvement and to be actively working with them, because I'm doing this work both with the library and with the Leeds Institute of Teaching and Teaching Excellence. So they work a lot with students, and this was a very important part of this. I think as we go, I will have a few questions for all of you. And I think, because I didn't think of this, I can't currently see the chat, but one of the things is to maybe write, if you could in the chat, write down methods which you have used in the past to get data from students or work with students to get information, because towards the end, I will kind of go through the things that have been set in the chat and kind of discuss them about how we can work with the processes, because this presentation will largely focus on the process rather than the ebook accessibility itself, because as I did this project, I realized that a lot of the methods in which we gather data from students, we work with students and do this kind of research, can be inaccessible in themselves. And I think there are a lot of assumptions that we have about our users and about how we do research that might be inaccessible, and that I believe do need, I think, critical thinking about, in order to think about how we improve our services. So the main method I used for this project has been user experience methods, which is very much centered around actively engaging users. So talking to students, sitting down with them, and very much working with them and having direct interaction with them. The other reason that I choose this method is because it allowed for more iterative engagement. So I could speak to students, learn something, then kind of shape my own ideas and go back to them. And I think that has been really helpful for this project. And they're fairly flexible and adaptive methods, which to this project will be quite important. Then examples of user experience methods, for those who are unfamiliar with those, are things like guerrilla interviews, or just general interviews where you sit down with a student and interview them, doing usability testing or observation, which means that I might take a web page and I might either ask students to use the web page and I kind of look at how they do that, and I ask them to speak aloud as they do this. Or one of the things that I've done is ask them to draw their experiences, which is what you can see on the screen, where I've asked students to draw how they use ebooks and what their experiences of using ebooks were. And those are the really nice drawings that I got actually on my office wall, because I find them helpful doing this project to keep it in mind. Or another example are what we've called graffiti walls, which is where we've put a board in the library and asked them to write feedback on it. And as well as being flexible and adaptive, I also use this method because it very much encourages positive disruption. It kind of allows to do quick testing and engagement with users and think about how to subtly change a process and then test with that. There's also a thing I'd like you to think about and post in the chat about this is, I think, to maybe think about the last time you might have directly worked with like students or users, and not in like an instructional way or asking a survey or inquiries desk type of work, but what the last time is you might have looked at a library process or a service and actively gone out and spoken with students, because I think that is, for me, was the main draw to these methods, is that it really forced me to speak with students and not make assumptions about their needs or how they interact with our services, which obviously when we think about accessibility is very important, because when we work in accessibility and we make assumptions about our users, there is a really big chance that we, instead of helping them, reinforce the barriers that were already in place by making assumptions about their needs and their experiences, which is what I wanted to prevent. And maybe something to write in the chat, because I'll be looking at it later again, is what issues there might be with either the options on the screen, and I've spoiled it a little bit in my abstract, but also maybe write any issues that you might have found with the methods that you have just put in the chat before. Like, how might they not be accessible to certain users? Or how might they exclude certain groups of students and library users? Or is there any sample bias that these methods are inviting? Because that is an issue that I did run into with my methods here, is that a lot of these methods are very visual, and especially when we think about disability, that is a barrier. If you are unable to engage visually, it means that the research methods themselves might exclude you from the process. And when we're looking at accessibility, that is obviously a major concern, especially with ebook and print disabilities. Having methods that reinforce this bias was a fairly big problem. And I did also speak with people more experienced on UX who had found the same issues. Another downside of classic UX methods is that there's a bias for students already on campus. So a lot of UX methods depend on spontaneously speaking to people in the library who are currently using the services. But what if the library itself is not accessible? How do we engage the people who we, in this case, need to hear from, who can't be there? How do we make sure that we also speak with them and work with them, and that their voices have a place in our processes? How do we make sure that we are able to hear them? And another downside of UX is that it very much bases itself on being cheap and fast prototypes, which is great for testing and for having iterative development and developing ideas. But there might be accessibility issues with this. And so we had to do quite a lot of thinking on accessible digital prototyping and how to have this balance between a prototype that was fast to develop and that we could work with, but that was also still accessible. And in a way, it almost went against the UX methodology, because I had to do quite a lot of like theoretical research before I could do anything else. Another thing that was difficult here is that when working with accessibility and disability, I found that the building trust with users, and when you want to do this in a fast kind of manner and this iterative manner, that isn't always that chance, and that I've had to both find a balance with this, but also a way that I think showed to the people that I was working with that we were taking their feedback very serious and that we were hearing it and listening to them. And again, it also falls in a bit to the, I think, the building trust to how do we plan for adjustments and how can we make sure that the methods used are adjustable and that there are options for all users and that they are accessible to all users and not just to a subset, or that I haven't made assumptions about their needs and the adjustments they might need, and that there's a way for people to indicate this without putting additional pressure on them, because the last thing we wish to do is put pressure on people to fix a system that disadvantages them when they have not been the people creating the system. That would be further so entrenching this inequality. And a much more basic challenge that perhaps sounds very simple is inaccessible forms. So we had to do ethics for this project, and a lot of ethics forms were inaccessible documents. So we had to think about how can we actually make those workable? How can I, because a lot of them are tables which don't work well with screen readers, or they're meant to have been designed in certain ways which don't work for certain disabilities. And one of the ways, and it will also be part of the next slides, how do we solve this? And one of the solutions was to work with other teams and other stakeholders in the university. So This is another picture of some of the work that we did. This is a prototype board with some students looking at it who we ask questions. So this is one of the many ways that we did the research, is kind of having different adaptable materials and formats. So on the digital formats, we did use Word as well as PDF. And I think that really helped because a lot of students did feedback that they really enjoyed having the different options available and being able to adjust materials themselves. This is also something that I specifically learned when working with other teams in the university. So a part of this project has also been connecting to disability services, connected to transcription services. And I think learning with them, and that has been a very key aspect of this, is something I'll also go into in the next slide, is that thinking about how do users experience our services, because I notice, at least in myself and also in others I've spoken to, that sometimes there's a bit of a idea that they only look at the library for certain things. So let's say a book problem is a library problem, and that therefore it's only us looking at it, but actually working with other teams has been really beneficial on this front, and kind of thinking about how students approach services, because students don't always separate our services into these concrete sort of silos in which we work as staff, but that they might have a more holistic view. That is one of the things that came out of this, of interspeaking with students, and that therefore having those relationships is really important to us. And I think it also helped me to think about the problem in a different and perhaps more critical way, almost, is in a sense of how do students actually engage with us, and how can I go to them rather than expect them to come to me? Which also I think also taps into the first bullet point here, which I've done a little bit out of order, is compensating users for their time was really important, and nearly all of them fed back that they really appreciated it, because in a way I was asking students for their time and input to help to address a problem that was disadvantaging them, and I felt that asking for their time without compensating would have been in bad faith. And I'm really grateful I was able to do so. And I think it also helped to build that trust with the people I worked with. And I think it also, when building relationships more generally, I think it also signaled the importance of the work and our investment in it. And obviously, I know that for a lot of people, there will be budgeting constraints, so everyone will be able to do it. But if possible, I would recommend doing it, because it was a very small practical thing that did signal the investment that we had and the importance of it. And again, I think lastly, one of the things that we tried to do was offer a lot of options. So for the interviews, they could be on campus, they could be online. Another thing that I tried to do, which was really helpful, I think, and if I recall is also on the next slide. Nope, it is not. Is for the interviews, I tried to use interview slots, so there would be a time set off in which they could attend, but there wasn't a strict expectation to be there at the start, because I said this is the time that I have scheduled for this. It will take approximately about half an hour, 40 minutes. You're free to come in at any time, just make sure there's enough at the end of it. And I know that a lot of students, just like carrying responsibilities, found it really helpful, because I think one thing that also struck me is that I didn't specifically ask or specify in the research call that this was only for students with disabilities or disabled users. I put it as we're looking at disability and accessibility and usability, but there is no constraint on who are able to attend, which I think was really helpful, because it meant that we had a broader set of people coming in. And I think also it ended up challenging me about my assumptions, the assumptions that I made about the users and how people might see themselves with regard to disability, because I am disabled myself, but the way I interact with is quite different from some of the people I spoke to. And I think some of the things that I also learned from working with users that I wish I would have known before is that I think we sometimes make assumptions about the information that students want from us, or the information disabled people would like with regard to accessibility. but that there were also assumptions about both the digital skills and literacy of people. And I think that can go both ways. I think I had to catch myself on both ends, that sometimes I thought, oh, this will be a challenge, and it really wasn't, or that I've made assumptions about what would have been manageable for someone and it wasn't. And I think that is something that I would recommend putting a lot of time in, because that is something where I might have gone wrong. And I think also what we prioritize in when doing this work around accessibility, about where the pain points are and focusing on that quite early. And one of the ways that I have attempted to address that, the moment I realized, I was really thinking about the user journeys, which is again a UX term, but it's about thinking less about the problem, but more thinking about how do people use our services from point A to B. So say I'm looking at ebooks in this case, how does someone actually end up with the book? Do they go through the discovery layer? Do they go through a reading list? And kind of following that trajectory. And I think in that process, I did learn about both the assumptions and prioritization. And I think it really helped to let students lead that process, thinking about the user journeys that they took and what information they did and didn't have. Because to give a practical example, to me, it is quite obvious which books are EBSCO, Procrest, or VLE books or Cambridge. To students, this might not be. I think some of them were able to tell apart some of the providers, but largely they weren't quite able to. They didn't really know what different platforms there were. Sometimes that they were different at all. A lot of them just assumed it was one set of materials they were looking at. And I think that is something that I think I only really found out when working very directly with them, and also thinking about at what points would they have been able to tell. And if, say, I create a resource that outlines how different platforms work, they need to know what that platform is and how to incorporate that in the process. And I've kind of touched on this. So the looking forwards, what have I learned from this and what would I do differently? My main point is to speak with students more and earlier. Despite doing a lot of it, I wish I'd done it more and I'd done it sooner, and that I had perhaps kind of split out the different elements better, because I think all of these were deserving of separate attention and had their own issues that I admittedly might have overlooked. So for example, the design of a resource. So how does it look? But then also, how is information laid out versus what information is in it? And how does it translate to student needs? Well, all I learned quite slightly separate issues that students interact with differently, and that I might have assumed to be subsumed in the same category, or that I might have had my own assumptions about, both on how I research them and how people see them. And I think that is something that I think there was a space to work on. The other thing is, because I think so part of this is very much based on taking a co-creation approach and having students at the table when we designed this, and when we spoke with them about their needs and how they'd like things to be laid out. And I think that perhaps there might have been too much of the co-creation and not enough of the co-designing, where I think it would have been good to have more of this input at an earlier stage. And I think there's maybe a lesson there more broadly in our sector. At what stage do we get this feedback, and at what stage do we invite user input? And how early are we willing to question our own assumptions? And I think that is something that came out really strongly to me, is that I didn't question my assumptions about user needs and experiences early enough. And I hope that is something that you'll be able to take away from this. And I think if I would have done so early, I would have been able to simplify the research process and have less barriers in place. And again, that is on one hand a regret, but I think also a learning opportunity that I hope will be helpful to all of you as well. Because I think if I would have known, I might have also had a wider range of methods, because I found that the ability to adapt was actually really key to making this work accessible and making it open to all. because I think I mentioned briefly, and I think this is where it really showed the value, is that instead of recruiting specifically for disabled students, I try to open it up, and I specifically worked with certain stakeholders, such as disability services and transcription services, on the recruitment of participants, which actually led to a much wider range of users being involved in the research. So there were actually quite a few disabled users, not all of them identifying as such. So perhaps I shouldn't say that, but who did have disabilities in a medical sense. But then also we had students who were carers or mature students, international students, people whose second language was English. And I think that was really helpful, and also touches on the challenging assumptions and language, in that this is a point where I did challenge my assumptions and my language really early on. And I think that the benefits of that were really tangible in who the research ended up including, but that then perhaps on other stages of my research, I didn't do that. And I think especially on the way I designed the methods, I could have done this earlier. And I think this maybe leads to the main point of the presentation, is that perhaps when we do this sort of work with our users, there is a need to examine the frame in which these issues exist or persist, and the ways in which we entrench it into our services and our systems and our processes. And when we ask for user feedback, how do we do that? So have we just used a survey, and have we actually done anything with this data? Have people been able to respond? Have we just been asking them the things that we expect to hear? Because I think the other thing that did work really well here, which I hope you'll be able to take away, is that having a wider range of perhaps non-traditional methods that were not just surveys, it was also, I think I got more diverse data, because it was easier to distinguish between what was declared and what was communicated, which you might not get in a survey. And what I mean by that is that certain students said, oh no, I don't experience any disabilities, I don't experience any difficulty in accessing materials. But I think when I then spoke to them further, they would talk about all kinds of difficulties they actually experienced. And they would quite often also express that they felt that in communicating this, they weren't being a good student or weren't being a good library user, which I found quite, I think, difficult to hear, but also understandable as still a PhD student myself. And I think that's why it is important that we challenge how we even just ask the questions and do that interaction. Because I think also there is a risk that, depending on how we design or research, that we expect users to either have the solution that they bring to us or have the words to express all of this. And that perhaps having a wider range, I think, empowers them to contribute in ways that are comfortable to them, and also sets a different kind of expectation from what we expect from them. And I thought that was really important to me, because I think several students did point out that having a more flexible setting and having that kind of freedom really helped them. And they found it really helpful to be in and to be able to express their experiences, and that it made them feel more valued, which I really enjoyed, and I hope encourages you to take a similar approach. And I think last is that what I think generally encourage everyone here to maybe have a look at UX methods, because whilst that there's issues with them, as I have highlighted, but I do think there is a real potential for them in critical librarianship to be applied, because I think it really forces you as a researcher to work directly with the students or library users or staff, depending on who you're looking at. It really platforms their voice, and I think democratizes them, because there is much less scope for your own assumptions or sort of biases to come up if you, I think, do it properly, or at least do it enough, because it as a method foregrounds and highlights participants' voices rather than researcher voices, which I think I've learned in this process that more classic or typical methods have a risk of doing, which is, I suppose, the point I'd like to leave you on to think about, and how we can open up the research process with our users when we think about service improvement, and whether that is perhaps scope to critically evaluate those in themselves. And then there is some of the references I use, I haven't used them all. Sorry, I haven't included them all here, but I think as a start or a primer. And then there is some space for questions, and I will have a look at the chat.
Thanks, Siobhan. That was great. I can see there is a couple of questions. I'll read them out. So we've got a question, well, two questions from Anne in the chat. So I'll put these together into one longer question. So Anne would like to know, how many users did you manage to engage with? And is your research written up available to share anywhere?
So it is not yet written up and available to share because I am still completing my secondment, but it will be there. How many people did I engage? Gosh, I'm having to think now because I did it in separate settings. I think I had like sit down interviews of 10 or 12, and then I think so. But then I also walked around the library and I just asked people, and that's a bit of a harder number because I think I just spent 2 days with a box of biscuits, actually going around and going, would you like to speak to me about your ebook experiences, or would you like to give me a little drawing? I think I have a total of 4 drawings, actually. So there's 4 people who drew things, and there's a lot of like short interviews. Then there's also a handful of people that I sat down and asked about a library website, the web pages, how they engaged it. So I don't really have a concrete number, but I found that, and again, that is another thing I probably should have thought about before, is that I didn't need the numbers because I had very strong qualitative feedback, which I did also take to someone on our senior management board of our exec team, and I said, so this is what I have found, and how can I best make a case? And having the numbers was actually fine. I hope that is helpful.
No, that's great, thanks. There's a question, I can see a question from Ramona as well. It says, was there any particular methods for recruiting disabled users in terms of accessibility that you used?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the sentence? It just broke off a bit.
So the question says, I'll read the whole thing again. Was there any particular method that you used for recruiting disabled users in terms of accessibility?
I think the main thing I've done there is I try to work closely with disability service and transcription services. So on one hand, I had a lot of my forms and materials checked for accessibility. Then, because I've been speaking to disability services for several months at that point, and transcription services also, they knew me and they knew the research and that we're serious about doing it. They were also they also put out the call, and I think that helped because of some of the students I spoke to did feedback to me that the fact that these other teams that they already trusted put out the call and were in some degree involved sort of helped them in understanding that they might have been that we were in a way trustworthy, if that makes sense. So and that is something that I am still thinking about in how to improve that, to be honest, because I think the main thing in order to make the recruiting self-accessible is that I didn't use any images. I purposefully did not make a poster because obviously I can share a poster to another team or to another area of the university and they can send it round, but the alt text might get lost. So I've purposefully only used flat text, very simple flat text, or a Word document, because Word documents, if you share them around, the formatting in like the headings and everything will be preserved, and users can kind of make changes to them as needed. And I think those were the 2 main recruiting like differences that I made that I might not have done in other types of research, but I might actually think about looking forward. I hope that answers it.
No, I think it absolutely does. That idea of building trust and also making sure that your resources that you're using in recruitment are accessible themselves. And we've probably got time for one last quick question. The question reads, how did you compensate your users for their time? Was it vouchers? Was it an hourly rate? How did you go about doing that?
Vouchers for an hourly rate. So I think I set for the interviews is 1 hour. I give them £15 for them because that is above living wage. I felt that was appropriate, and the focus was slightly more when I'm just approaching people in the library. It's very much, here's a snack.
No, excellent. And it's great to hear, yes, meeting real living wage. That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll have a response to some of the chat comments as well in a moment.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Siobhan. If we could all express our thanks in the chat. We now have a break for 15 minutes, and I would really encourage everybody to actually do take that break. Don't check your emails, go and look at a tree, go and make a cup of tea, go and stroke a pet, but do something different so that you've had some time away from your screen. Thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you all back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.